This episode of McCall's Quilt and Quilt Along is brought to you by Benartex, fabric for quilters by quilters. Hi, welcome back to McCall's Glorieta Quilt Along. I'm Laura Roberts and I'm your tour guide through this wonderful adventure. And I want to show you some things today that are really important for you to have success with this quilt. There's just a few techniques you may already know, but we'll just sort of do a refresher because there are so many biased edges on this quilt. It's important to know how to handle them. And this won't be the only time I talk about them. I'll be showing you things as we go through the next several lessons. But to get started, I just wanted to remind you, if you don't have your kit yet, you're going to want to go ahead and order it. So you can go to mccallsquilting.com/quiltalong. And these are the fabrics. They're the Ribbon Floral collection from Benartex. And what I'm going to talk about first is bias. And for a lot of you, this is going to be old hat, but I know there's always a person or two out there that doesn't know this yet, so we might as well cover it. Okay, when I talk about bias, I'm talking about grain. Every fabric has a vertical grain or lengthwise grain, a crosswise grain, and a bias grain. You can tell which is which by looking like this. This is a piece of fabric, and of course, and if I want to know which bias it is, now there are no selvages left to tell me, and it could be going either way, right? Well, when I pull on it this way, you can see it moves, all right? When I pull on it, whoops, this way, it doesn't go anywhere. Look at that right here. You see how that doesn't pull at all? That's the lengthwise grain. That's the one that runs down parallel to the selvage. The other way that goes from side to side, in other words, with this, I have selvage by this hand and selvage at this hand, it does move. But when I do the bias is the diagonal. Boy, talk about movement. Look at this. You see that? Do you see how far that stretches? Well, it's really handy to have that kind of stretch in a lot of ways. When you're, for instance, if you're binding a quilt and you have scallops and you need to go around a corner, it's really handy. Same with applique, if you're appliquing something curved. But when you're doing things that are just straight seams and you have bias, you don't want it to move. You don't want that stretch. So I'm going to show you the best ways I know to control it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the iron. And here I have a couple of those fabrics that are in the quilt. And this one I've already put some starch on. And so it doesn't move nearly as easily. And this one I haven't done yet. And you can see it really moves on the bias. So what I do, if I know I'm going to be cutting a lot of bias pieces and using bias throughout a quilt, I always press my fabrics first with either spray starch or starch alternative. You know, just the plain stuff you get at the grocery store. The starch alternative is nice because it doesn't have starch, which means that it's not going to provide food for any insects. If you use starch, you're going to want to wash your leftover pieces, wash your scraps when you're done, so you're not storing fabric with starch in it, okay? But it doesn't matter which one you use, they both work really well. And I'm just going to spray this. Now I've got a lot on here. You don't have to use that much, but I just want to show you what a big difference it makes. My little handy dandy iron. Aren't these pretty? You know, I'm under these lights in the studio and all of a sudden those little, they look like, I don't know, like little gold coins on some sort of a, oh, maybe an Indian necklace or a belly dancer belt, you know, those little coin belts. It's just magic. These are the prettiest fabrics. So you can see on the back how much starch I got on there. I got this really wet. I would not normally get it this wet. So when you're home, you don't need to get it soaked like that. But I want to really iron this in because I want you to see how different it is. And it's not going to look different if the starch isn't dry. In case you don't know, just like paper towel, when you have fabric wet, you can stretch it way out of shape. So when you're ironing your fabric, you've just taken it, you've gotten it home and maybe you washed it through the dryer, or even you're just going to iron it because it just came off the bolt and has some folds in it, you go ahead and use steam. It's fine to use steam at that point. But when you're ironing things open, when you're pressing pieces open, don't use steam, use a dry iron, because steam can distort it because it gets wet, that fabric gets wet, and now it's going to start skewing on you. So just a tip, if you're pressing things after you've pieced them, I recommend a dry iron or a teeny weeny bit of steam if you really want it there. Okay, so this is all ironed in, and I want to show you. Okay, it's not stiff like paper, but look, it's much more controllable. It's not nearly as wiggly as it was. And it's going to be important for you to have your fabric as stable as possible. So go ahead, use either spray starch or the starch alternative, and get that fabric all ready to go. Okay? So do that before you cut anything. All right? That's step number one. Okay, now, another thing I want to talk to you about is the fact that this quilt has a couple of directional fabrics. And one of these is this guy. It's a directional fabric that is used as a background. And I wanted to show you all the cool things you can do and how you can do them. Now, the actual quilt behind me wasn't made this way, and it's not going to tell you how to do this in the instructions, which is why we're going over it now. In case you want to do this, you're going to be wanting to think ahead. All right, so when I'm talking about a directional fabric, I know I've touched on it. It's a fabric that has an up and a down or left and right. This one obviously looks different that way from that way. This fabric really doesn't. See, it's not really directional because there are guys going up here, turn it this way, there are guys going up. So that's not directional, but this one is. And this is a little block I made. You'll be making these blocks too. It's the center of one of the blocks behind me. And you'll see that the background, do you see that? They're all going the same direction. Okay, looks like it would just happen, right? But it doesn't. And you have to plan it out. And another thing you have to plan not just these pieces, but if you have a block that has strips going around, like the big center block, you're going to have to plan how you cut this guy. So let's get showing you what I mean. Okay, these are, of course, pieced rectangles or flying geese. Okay, I can put the triangles like that. And do you see how the design of the fabric goes vertically? Now, if I swap them around, you see how now they're going horizontally? Okay, what would happen if I take one from over here and put that there? Well, now they're not going the same direction. So one of the first things I'm going to do if I want to do this is cut everybody and then lay them out so I know they're going the same direction. But in this case, let's say this is the top flying goose in a block, and here's the bottom flying goose and the side flying goose. All right. In order to get them all running the same way, they're going to be cut differently. Now this guy, if it's going horizontally, I want to put triangles there that are horizontal. Well, that's not. What if I move it over here? Now it is. Okay. So I'm going to do the same thing here. Now here's a question. Am I going to be able to do that where it can go either direction if I cut it this way? How about if I cut it that way? Because you see, I've got the fabric going different directions. If I cut it the same way, are they still going to be the same when I get playing with them? Does that look the same to you? No, they're not the same. You see that? There's no way that I can turn this and have it match these guys. So one of the things you're going to be doing, you'll either be turning the fabric to make it two different directions before you cut, or you cut in two different directions. Okay, so that's planning for this sort of a triangle. It's on an outside of a flying goose. And you can see that you can easily arrange them to do that. Now, sometimes instead of cutting a half square triangle, you're going to cut a triangle, it's a quarter square triangle, where you take a square of fabric and you cut it apart like that in two directions. Well, what this gives you, when you take it apart, you have two triangles, each of two different orientations. And it looks like this. Okay, there's one, and there's the other, horizontal and vertical. And then I have another horizontal here and another vertical here. Well, because it's a quarter square triangle, it's not coming the same way. You see how this is parallel to the short side, the directional fabric's running parallel to the short side? Well, here the direction is running from point to side over here. It's not going like that, all right? And that's because it's a quarter square triangle, meaning it was a square that was cut 2 times diagonally. And that's important because depending on what kind of a unit you're making, you're going to want to cut quarter square triangles. Now, we do tell you when to do that. We tell you when to cut quarter square triangles because you would do it whether you were working with a directional fabric or not. But I just wanted to show you that when it's something like a flying goose on the corners, you're doing a half square triangle. But to get it all different, the same things running the same way, in here, you're going to have to cut them as quarter square triangles because when they're not a corner, when they're in the middle like this, see, you need some that will go on the side and some that go on the top and bottom because that guy is not running the same way, all right? It makes perfect sense once you're cutting and playing with it. You'll feel much more comfortable with it. Okay, so now another thing is, what if you want to sew some squares together, you know, where you draw a line in the back and you sew 1/4 of an inch from each side and it gives you triangle squares. Okay, how am I going to make them so that they're different? Because they're going to need to be on some of these corners. Okay, the way I do it is, this is your underneath fabric, right? It just sits like that. And then these guys, okay, if I have them oriented the same way, which I do right now, and I turn them over, you'll see that the pencil marks are going opposite directions. These will, in fact, turn out differently because this one's going from bottom left to upper right, and this is going from top left to bottom right. And you can look on the back of the fabric on the wrong side. You can see that I have these 2 oriented in the same way when, when I'm drawing my lines in different directions. So I'm going to show you what these look like once they're sewn together and cut apart. So I'm just going to head over to the machine here. Alrighty, get my glasses on so I can see. Okay. And I'm just putting these, like you always do, right sides together. There we go. And I'm going to sew 1/4 inch from that line. There we go. Okay. And one of my favorite tools is an awl. If you don't have one, you'll see that I use one all the time. And I use it right here just to make sure that it goes right under the presser foot the way I want it to. Okay, so that one's going through that way. Now I'm just going to pair up that other one. Okay. There we go. Oh, we'll just put this guy under. Let's do the same thing. Okay, and to get my corners the way I want them, I would use the awl like that and just hold it in place like that. At home, I usually take a little more time to align things just right, but you don't need to have them aligned just right to see what I'm doing. There we go. And since these pieces aren't actually going into a block, it doesn't matter. But when you're sewing yours, you're going to want to make sure you get the squares really aligned with one another before you start stitching. And if you want to throw a couple pins in there, by all means. Okay, so now I'm going to sew 1/4 inch on the other side, 1/4 inch from the line. Just run it right down there. There's one. And here's the other. There we go. Okay. So those are sewn, and I'm just going to cut the threads off, like that. And now I'm going to show you what happens when we cut them apart. Okay, so remember I had them so that the fabric itself is going horizontally, the print, and then I sewed 2 different directions. Okay, so when I cut this apart, I'll do this one first, and I'm going to press it open so you can see. I have to move all my little guys out of the way. Okay, and I'm just going to press these guys. Now I recommend that you set the seam all the time, every time. try to remember to press the seam before you open it. It's called setting the seam. And I didn't used to do this, and then I actually tried it, and I found it to be a whole lot, it's actually valuable. And the reason is because when you set the seam, the thread that you just sewed with gets a chance to kind of sink down and integrate with the fabric itself. And obviously, if you're at home sewing, I would not be using green on beige were I home, but this way you can see it, all right? So then you want to press toward the dark side, and the easiest way to do that is to put the darker fabric up. Alrighty, and open up, and just gently. Now, if you're pressing too hard or you're pulling on that, it's going to really let that bias do bad things. You want to be gentle when you press, but you do want to make sure you're getting it open. Right down here, it's really easy to not get that open. And if you don't get it open all the way, all of a sudden things aren't matching up like you want them to. Okay, there's one. And here's the other one. Okay. If you're not sure, if you want to experiment with this a little bit, go to your stash, pick out any directional fabric. You know, it could be mice all running the same way or anything that's directional, and play with it a little bit. Okay, so that's what this one turned out like. You realize that they're exactly the same, right? Two of the same ones from the square that you sewed. And now I'm going to cut the other one in half, like this. You know how to do that. I know you do it lots of times. Okay, same thing. I'm going to set the seams. Here we go. Okay. Like, oops, look at that. I got that seam allowance sticking up. Okay, put the darker fabric on top and press that open. Again, kind of gently. You don't want to yank on it. Well, I'm going to show you what that looks like if you do. Okay, and let's just press this guy open. Isn't that pretty? No, I don't love fabric, not me. I just, I've always loved Benartex fabrics because they have always had these beautiful little metallic touches, but this one just makes me happy. Okay, so this was the second pair. Notice anything? Of course you do. This one's horizontal and this one's vertical. All right, so that's how you're going to make this sort of a unit in a way that you can arrange them however you need to make them stay horizontal. And if, for instance, you were doing a little corner like this, we have lots of corners in this quilt that we'll just use a piece of fabric there as a background just so you can see. They kind of look like butterflies where you have the triangles facing each other like that. We'll just make that a little square. Okay, like that. There's your little block unit right there. Okay, there we go. Gosh, it's a good thing fabric will fold. Okay, what's wrong with that? Do you see a problem? Well, that guy's going the right way. Well, he's sure not, which means, are they different? They are different. How about that one? That's better. I like that a lot. Okay, that works. What if this unit is in the upper right corner? And I use these same two. Oops, all of a sudden those two don't work. I'm going to have to use these two to get that same look. Okay, so just to show you again, when you have, let's say, if you look at the quilt, you'll see in that big center block, you'll see this happening. There are corner units that look like butterflies going out, a couple of different sizes. And in order to get the butterflies looking like they're running out, flying away, they go away like that. So these are like butterfly wings. I guess they're like bow ties too, but I always think of them as butterflies. Okay, so I can arrange them like that. Yay, look at this. See how they're doing just what I want them to do? But remember, they're different. They're not the same unit. So you want to plan ahead when you're thinking about cutting and about making these units, because the instructions will tell you to draw a diagonal line on the wrong side, blah, blah, blah. So plan. Make sure that you know that you're going to be cutting half this way and half that way, drawing your lines half this way and half that way. Okay, another little thing to think about when you're cutting is there are in that first great big block that we're making, you'll see that there are flying geese, also known as pieced rectangles, that have the goose part, the body of the goose. There, this part here. That right there is actually pieced. It's got strips and pieces going like that. Okay, so you're going to have multiple pieces in this unit. And one of the pieces that they're calling for is a 2-inch by, I think it's 14-inch strip. Okay, you're going to have to cut 2 on the lengthwise grain and 2 on the crosswise grain, because you're going to be needing to cut 2 that'll run like that and 2 that'll run like that. If you cut them all in the same direction, it's not going to work. So I'd be cutting 2 on the crosswise grain, 2 on the lengthwise grain. Okay? The little triangles that we're using, you don't need to worry about them because they're cut as quarter square triangles with the 2 diagonal cuts. So they're already going to be the right way. Okay, so that's how you cut, and think ahead of time if you want these guys to all run the same direction. All right, and I'll go over this again when we get closer to using it, but I wanted you to be thinking about it. Just in case you start working ahead and doing a little cutting, better to know what you're coming up with. Okay, so another thing I want to talk to you about are match points. If you're going to be sewing triangles together, oops, my triangles went running away. If you're going to be sewing triangles to triangles, or triangles to other units, sometimes you really need to mark match points. Oh, and that was another thing I was going to say. You absolutely do not have to make your background, it's all running the same direction. You do not. This quilt behind me, which is incredibly beautiful, doesn't have that directional thing going on. It was just me thinking you might have fun with it, but you certainly don't have to. Okay, it's perfectly fine to have them like that. So, marking match points. How do we do that? Well, at one point you're going to be marking match points on the back of a triangle you've pieced. But before we even get to that, I'll show you how to mark match points on a regular piece of fabric. I've got to get my tools here. Okay, I like to mark with pencil when I can. Sometimes I just don't see it. If it's the back of a busy fabric, you might not see that pencil. I'm thinking it's going to show up here, but if it doesn't, let's just turn that around. Okay, what you do is you're going to put the 1/4-inch mark on the ruler right on the very edge, not inside. Do you see that? Even if you're a thread in, it's too far in. Right on the edge like that. I'm going to hold that firmly, and I'm just going to make a couple little lines like this. They won't show through because you're actually going to be stitching on those lines. So you don't need to worry about them showing through. Okay? And I know that usually you don't mark a corner, but there are some places in this quilt where you're going to want that corner marked. You don't have to do it on all of them, but if just think ahead. Usually on a triangle like this, I would just mark these 2. Okay. So now when I come over here and mark, do you see what I'm doing? I'm making lines that cross. That is your match point, right where they cross. Okay. Now if I want to sew this to something dark, especially something really dark, like one of these, okay, if I go to mark this with my pencil, let's see, right there, it might be really hard to see. I would have to really look. Okay, so one alternative, you can try a pen. Some pens work better than others. Don't use anything that's going to bleed through, because if it spreads out, it will show. So you need to try it on scrap first. This pen I know works, but even then I can't see it. Okay. What do you do when you're working with something really dark? You can use something, this is my favorite, this is a little chalk marker. And you can also use chalk pencils. I'm not as wild about them because I think they're a little bit thick, but this doesn't make a super skinny mark either. So you're going to want to try different ones. There are pink ones and yellow ones. The silver ones are really useful. There's also, of course, white. But this is the little guy I like. So again, I'm putting that ruler right there in that 1/4-inch. Like that. And I'm going to mark, you just roll that right along the edge of the ruler. Like that. I need to move my ruler down. This piece is longer than the last one was. Like that. And did you see that little chalk line? Okay. Same thing. I'm going to come over here, and I'm just going to mark like that. Okay, and the less you use, believe it or not, and it's a thinner mark, it's easier to see. It's easier to see exactly where that pin should go. But what's really cool about this stuff, okay, right? It just brushes away. It's just gone. Sometimes you actually have to remark if you handle it a lot. So, how do you use a match point? Okay, I'm going to sew those two together. And the way you use a match point, it's pretty easy. It's very easy. I'm going to put the pin, the first pin, right through that intersection. Do you see that intersection? I'm going to stick the pin right through here. Okay, right through the middle. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here. I can kind of eyeball it and get close. Let's see how close I was. Not close enough. Okay, so let's see, right? No. When you're sitting at home, it's easier. There we go. Okay, so it went through this one and came out there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm aligning the other edges, and I'm going to pull this pin kind of right up there. I'm leaving it kind of taut, but I'm not going to actually use that pin to secure, because if I wiggle it now, it's going to put everything off out of alignment. So instead, I'm going to take a pin, and I'm going to pin right next to it. Oops. Like that, keeping that positioning pin right there where it is vertical, nice and tight. You can even put a little pin out here if you want to. And then I'm going to make sure that the whole thing's aligned, like that. There we go. Okay, that looks good. And I'm going to come over here, and I'll do the same thing with this match point. So I'm going to go through here. Let's see if it goes right through the other one. Now see, remember I told you sometimes you're going to want to mark on the corner? That's the time. I didn't mark that corner. But I don't even have to unpin that one to mark this. Okay. Oops, there we go. I love the chalk markers. I've been using these chalk markers for, how long have I been quilting now? I've been using these chalk markers for 30 years. They've been around that long. Okay. And they're different brands, they're different types. Some are refillable. This one, just when it runs out, it runs out. Okay, so pin through that one. Did it come out there? Yep, it's good. Okay, pull the positioning pin down, and then just pin to either side. Oh, I can pin here if I want, but I'm not going to. And now you take the positioning pins out before you sew the seam. Okay, so I'm just going to take this over here to the machine, and I'll sew this one quick seam for you. Oh, and I always use one of these little thread catchers so I don't have my fabric going down the hole and disappearing. You know how unfun that is. Okay, where's my awl? There we go. Now, you don't want to sew over pins. That's not a good idea. When pins break, if you sew over pins, eventually you're going to sew over one and it will snap. When they snap, sometimes they go down into the works of the machine, but most of the time they fly. Pins can fly. So, you know, if you're not wearing glasses, you can be in real trouble. So try really hard not to sew over pins. I will try really hard not to sew over pins in front of you. How's that? Okay, so my awl is just holding that together like that, right under the foot. Okay, and then when that opens up, you see it's right where it should be. You see it's aligned right the way it's supposed to be. Okay, so that's what match points do for you. Now the one other thing that's really important with this quilt is that 1/4 inch seam. If you don't have an accurate 1/4 inch seam with this quilt, there's so many intersections, there's so many little pieces that all go together. If you don't have an accurate 1/4 inch seam, you're going to be really frustrated. So please, take the time. It'll take you 5 minutes to check yours, okay? Just do this. Cut 3 pieces of fabric, 1.5 inches wide, however long you want. These are 6 inches. Oh, and again, 1.5 inches wide, 3 of them that are 1.5 inches wide. And then what you would do is you'll sew this seam there and this seam here. So you sew all 3 together and you press them the way you normally press them. Then you measure them, okay? You measure from side to side. If you have sewn them together with an accurate 1/4 inch seam and pressed them open properly, from here to here, that should be 3.5 inches. Let's measure this one. I did this one, and as you can see, it's close. If you look right here, it's close, but it's close to a 1/16 of an inch off. And I'm going to move this over so I can really see, get that edge perfect. Yeah, it's off a little bit. Now it looks good. Maybe it was how I had the ruler. Okay, that looks okay, I think. Let's see what the next one is. Let's put that ruler right on top, because sometimes I don't get that edge on. And when I'm doing something like this, I want to make sure, ooh, something looks weird. Well, the center purple isn't quite an inch wide. Let's measure. If I put the 1 inch mark on that edge, oh golly, that's not coming. With 3.5 inches, it should be all the way over to 4.5 inches. And do you see this? You see that's like 1/8 of an inch. Okay, look at how close that looks on the back to a 1/4 of an inch. It really doesn't look that far off. And if you measure here, you might say, oh, that's pretty close. You know, look at that 1/4 inch, that's not bad. If you're a 1/16 of an inch off on your seam, on every seam, and you're doing something like well, even something like this middle block behind me, there are a lot of seams. If you have 16 seams and you're 1/16 of an inch off, you're going to be an inch off. And even if you only have 8 seams, you're 1/2 inch off, which of course means that that block's not going to work with blocks that have a different number of seams. So it's really important that you get that 1/4 inch right. Let's see about this one. Okay, I'm just going to put that 1 inch line again and look at it. Well, now remember, I was looking at that first one and I was thinking it wasn't working, but then I got it under the line, it was fine. Well, if I look at this one, that is a 1/16 of an inch off, isn't it? That is too darn small. It needs to be 3.5 inches and it's a 1/16 of an inch short. It matters. So what that tells me is that I'm taking a seam allowance that's too big. If you have a wider than you should have, if your unit is too wide, that means that you're not taking up enough in the seam. If your unit is too narrow, it means your seam allowance is too big. Okay? So work with it. Get your seam allowance right until you can measure it like that and have it come out just right at 3.5 inches. Okay? So again, three strips at 1.5 inches by 6. You sew them together with a normal 1/4 inch seam, whatever your 1/4 inch seam is, using whatever marker or line or foot you have, and you press it open. Press it open well. Press it open the way you would press anything that's in your quilt. And then measure. If you don't have 3.5 inches, you need to change that seam. Okay, so if it's less than 3.5 inches, that means you've taken up more than you should in the seam allowance. So your seam allowance is too big. If it's wider than 3.5 inches, it means you didn't get enough in that seam. So your seam allowance is too narrow. Okay? Work with this until you really have it down, until you know exactly where you need to move that fabric under your presser foot to get that exact 1/4 inch seam. Okay? It's worth doing. If you're sure, 100% sure that your 1/4 inch seam is absolutely right, take the time to do it anyway. You'd be surprised. I'm surprised. I probably do this to myself about every 3 or 4 months. I do it again because I tend to run to a seam that's too small. And then I have to catch myself. Okay? So those are the things I want you to be comfortable with as we start. Talk about bias, work with bias a little bit, work with match points, and of course the seam allowance, and then really kind of think about maybe you want to try doing a block where all the background fabrics are in the same direction. Okay? Now, you do have a little bit of homework. The first thing you get to do is cut your border strips. It's the first listing under cutting, okay? Don't cut anything else. We're going to cut the fabrics for each block as we get to that block, all right? Because, well, sometimes it's just more fun that way. It's easier in that you're not doing 1,000 million hours of cutting before you get to sew anything, because that's really, I don't like doing that myself. And it's kind of fun to just do a little cutting before each week. So go ahead and cut your border strips, just like they're listed, and go ahead and please give these things a try. Just get comfortable with them. And when I come back next week, we're going to make that great big beautiful block in the middle. All right, so thank you for joining me. If you want to get the kit, go to mccallsquilting.com/quiltalong, and you can get the fabrics for the Glorieta quilt. And I can't wait to see you back here next time, so I hope you're having a wonderful time learning new things and sewing with me. Thank you so much for being here. See you next time. This episode of McCall's Quilting Quilt-Along is brought to you by BetterTex, fabric for quilters by quilters.